Okay, so for the next episode of this video series we're going on to the Supercharger, which is a bit out of sequence. However, this is the Supercharger from my ground running Merlin, which I do shows with, and it's been suffering from high oil consumption. We put the cause of this down to the tail bearing on the Supercharger, and it's had to come off. And really it's quicker for me to overhaul the Supercharger from the engine, which we're building in this video series, than it is to take this apart, because it's actually going to need some machining. I've managed to catch it before the impeller has started to contact the casing, but only just, I have to say. So we'll have a quick look at this and what's wrong with it and the two kind of common faults you get with them, and then we can go on to assembling the Supercharger from the Halifax engine, which I'm then going to put onto my ground running engine and actually run it, certainly through until this coming winter, when I'll probably overhaul this one and swap them back over again. The reason I'm squashed into this corner of the workshop down here to work on it is apparent. If we go, because obviously this Land Rover lives in here as well. The Land Rover's currently got no rear axle. It's having the gearing changed in the differential. So I've got that little space in the front of the workshop. I've got this little bench to work on. The Merlin lives in another garage and there's no room in there either, so we're going to work on the bench. But let's have a look at this Supercharger first. The shaft has a plain bearing on the tail end of it, which runs in this casing here, and it's got two concentric bushes. You can see that one's been running, like it's had end thrust on it, and it's machined a step into it for some weird reason. I mean, I made these bushes about 25 years ago and the engine's done 500 hours, so apart from the fact that they appear to have a bit of oil contamination damage to them, they got grooves in them, I'm really not complaining. The casing, the inlet casing, which I call the baby's bum, which I'll show you because of the shape of it later on, has been repaired anyway because the engine was crash damaged, and the nut has just, because of the play in these bushes, the nut has just started contacting that labyrinth sleeve inside there. What happens if it carries on is that this impeller, which has fairly small clearances down the side of the blades, will then start contacting the casing. But when I got it apart, I also found something else, which is another known issue that they used to get with these. And actually, if I get hold of this, see, it feels fairly rigid there, but if I actually pull it a bit harder, if I can do it, there, it's actually jumping up and down quite a bit. And I think that the ball race, which is on the other end of it, if I just tip it up, it has a high-speed ball bearing just behind those two gears in there, and I think that that has been rotating in its housing, which is another fault that I have with them. And what they did later on was incorporated a ball race with a flange on the outside of it built into it with bolts or studs to hold it in place, so the outer race can't rotate. And here we have a set of blower casings which show the results of an in-flight bearing failure. The impeller has just been rubbing on the intake end of the casing there. It's put a bit of a burr on the edge down there. And when you look at the other half of the casing, the back of the impeller's been running on there because the ball race has come away from the back of it, as you'll see in a minute. There's a groove around here which is part of a labyrinth seal for the impeller, and it's been running out and basically machining its way into there even further. And when you look at the back of it, the bearing housing has actually broken away. It's held in by a locking ring on the outside, which is prevented from coming undone by this locking device here. That's still in place. The bearing housing has just completely come away on the back of there. And this is what it should look like inside there. So you've got these threads on the outside. The bearing sits inside that steel liner, and this is a bearing retainer that goes on there, and that's the locking plate which you saw on the other one. So just to recap, the reason for choosing the Halifax Merlin to loan its supercharger for my own engine is because I think this casing is either going to need remachining or it's going to need a new steel liner at the very least for that ball race. In here, what I did originally was I MIG welded enough onto it there and round there without heating the casing up too much, which is why it looks like it does, in order to just keep this sleeve in place. And I put a piece of tube in here where it was damaged, which goes up to the bearing breather at the top there. So basically, I think the answer now I've got a bit more ability than I had 25 years ago, is going to be to weld this up properly and remachine it on the miller, possibly put, if necessary, put an oversized bush in there, but probably not. I think that might be all right if I can keep everything true. And even weld up these two broken lugs on it while I'm at it. There's quite a bit of work in that. I've got events to do with the other engine. And just going back to the 500 hours that I mentioned before, the overhaul period of this Merlin 20 would actually have been 300 hours. Nowadays, you can run this supercharger for 500 hours, but that is the overhaul rebuild period for the engine. So when I said I'm happy with the homemade bushes that were in it, yeah, it's fine. I mean, it's still running. I caught it in time before anything really bad happened, so I'm happy with that, in effect. It probably would have lasted longer if it had original bushes in it. It was just the issues with getting hold of parts back then, really, before I got to know all the relevant people. So that's how it is, and I'll do another video when I get this thing apart completely to sort of show what all the damage was and to show how I'm going to repair it. So we're going to start with the assembly of the impeller shaft into this casing. It's a 2-speed supercharger, and in another video I'll show the rebuild of the gearbox that actually drives this. And you've got these two gears onto the shaft. One of them's machined onto the shaft and the other one is actually fitted separately and retained by that nut. And the two impeller speeds relative to the crankshaft are 8.15 and 9.49 times faster than the crank, which give you altitudes where the carburetor is at full throttle, so the maximum power you can get at altitude is 13,000 feet, and then in high gear at 21,000 feet. So after those altitudes, in those gears the power starts to tail off as it's got less air. Now the bearing, this is the original bearing that was in this engine, and it feels really good. Probably nothing much wrong with it, but we don't want to use it because there could be corrosion in it. And this engine was built in early 1942, by which time the Americans were providing parts for the Merlin, not just for Packards. This particular bearing, I don't know if it's possible to read it on the camera there, but it says Norma, and Norma Hoffman was an American division of Hoffman bearings. Prior to that, they would have been made by Hoffman. They look identical to this in the UK, and we've actually got a brand new one here in the box, and I'm going to put this in. You certainly wouldn't if you were flying this. You don't normally put these in because when a bearing's sitting, especially for this many years, you can get effects on the hardness of the two races where the balls are sitting, and it's called Brinelling. This is a later version of the bearing which superseded this bronze cage because they were concerned, they had failures of these bearings, and they were concerned that because it's splash fed with oil from one end, that it wasn't getting all the way through to the back half of the bearing, or not enough oil anyway. So they went over to a pressed steel cage for probably for the rest of World War II actually, on these superchargers, which has a better centrifuge effect, and there's more room inside there for the oil to get around, and these were a lot more successful. So I'm going to clean this up and put it in on the basis that the engine's going to run for a few hours, and then ultimately when it comes back off my engine and we put it back on this one, I'll have a look at the bearing, see what it's like, and I'll probably actually replace it with a new one. So when I built my engine originally, I was able to get a brand new Hoffman bearing, which was a descendant of this one, and it's basically a high speed version of this bearing, which is metric. So the shaft inside here is 25mm, it's not 1 inch, and you can go and buy this 6305 bearing off the shelf anywhere. The only difference really with it on this engine is that it has a higher RPM rating, which basically means it's got slightly bigger clearance in it. And I was able to get one, and they said that it was used on grinding machines, industrial grinders, that type of thing. So ultimately I am going to change it, but I thought, well, I might as well use this, seeing as I've got it and it looks in very good condition, so I'm going to clean it off, put it in. So here's our new bearing ready to go in. We've got behind it this centrifuge which sits down inside there, and there are radial holes drilled around the back of this housing that go into a breather system to take oil away. And then from the other side there's this collar that goes on the shaft, which will basically, it has a very close clearance in that hole there. So the whole idea of all of this is to prevent oil passing through into the supercharger itself, into the compressor housing. It's difficult as well because you have various different pressures and vacuums inside the blower depending on the conditions of the engine at the time. But in flight you can assume it usually runs under boost, and there should be some pressure behind here which actually pushes the oil back out. And then this retaining cap goes on afterwards. So this locking plate has 2 holes in it and 2 different sets of teeth, because it's actually, it gives you 4 different positions that you can lock this thing up in, which means that basically wherever that stops you're going to end up with a position where this will just drop straight in like that. Put that on, and that's on it. It's got a little tab washer for the nut. There, that's that locked up. So now we'll pop the shaft in. There's a distance piece there for setting the position of the gears. Now we can flip it over and start working on the other side. So the next component that goes on is this top hat. It goes on around. And again, there's a very small clearance between the top end of that and this part of the casing to seal that area there with the vent holes in it. Now I've marked this impeller after I took it all off. They normally have balance markings on them, because the impeller, which is an aluminium forging, the rotating inlet guide vanes, which are a steel forging, and the shaft and the components that are fitted to it are usually balanced as a group. I can't actually see, they sometimes remove small sections in between here by machining. I can't actually see any balancing on this, so I think they've just got lucky there. They might have removed some material, I don't know. But there's a few interesting things on it anyway. There's a blue pen mark on there of some description, possibly on there as well. There's also a blue mark on there. I suspect these are something to do with balancing. I don't know why it's been cleaned out like that, because this is how it came out of the engine. And my suspicion at the moment is that this engine hadn't been overhauled. So although it might have used some previously used parts out of other engines, I think it hadn't been back in for a rebuild. But the anodizing on the rest of this thing is as good as the day it was made. It's a lovely thing. So it's splined onto the shaft, and then the rotating guide vanes are then splined onto the shaft above this. There's the feature on the back of the impeller which fits into this slot, and again forms another air seal, and it's quite interesting again how small the clearances are in here. I've got a mark on that blade there. Line this up. Another interesting point actually is that, we can see it now, the outer extremity of these blades, just this last little bit here, is more shiny, and it's not been touching this further back. So what they do is, when they make this assembly, they want the ends of these blades just to be pressing slightly harder on the end of there rather than back here. So the first part of this thing, this vane to contact, is going to be all the ends, and then when you screw the nut down in the middle, you're pressing the middle down, and it stops these things from fluttering and vibrating and potentially failing. So they did think of a lot of things back in the day. It's not quite on, but I'm going to wind it on the rest of the way with the nut. Yeah, it's strange. I've just been having a look at this because there's a very slight step on the back of these vanes, between the vanes and the impeller, and subsequently a very slight step on the front of them. Now, I've never come across that before. They normally run flush, and there are about 4 different positions on these splines where you can align them, but they all align in the same way, all 4 of them. So It's just obviously a number that can be divided by 4. So if I move around to the next spline, they're obviously nowhere near in line, so the markings I had on it are correct. But for some reason, and I'm thinking they maybe used components from another engine when they built it, previously used components, because clearly they've done something to the, they've had to refurbish the impeller in some way because of all this sanding I've done on here, and I don't think that's anything to do with balancing it. So anyway, there you go. They're pretty good, but they're just not exactly in line for some strange reason. So I'm going to pop these parts back in. I'm just going to do the nut up initially by hand without the tab washer in there, and then I'm going to remove these parts and put the tab washer back in. But you do find weird stuff like that on these. But if it worked, I suppose it was okay. Now we're up to that point. I'm going to put the assembly spanner into the vise on the milling machine because it's the nearest convenient thing I've got, and then we'll put this on there and tighten that up. I'm just going to pull it up to that sort of tightness initially. I don't use a torque setting on these, but I do know how tight they are, and that's the length of the bar that I'm using, and they are very tight when they're done up. Just making sure that everything's free. Obviously, being a ball race just at one end of it, and also, as I mentioned before, there's a bit more clearance in these type of high-speed ball bearings. There's this movement, and with very small clearances and everything, you can make it touch. You hear that, you know, you can actually make it touch the housing. Once it's centred by this bush, then there's no problem. But I'm just making sure that there's nothing untoward, any funny noises coming from it. We'll lock it back up again. And I have to torque it up, and you can see that the tab washer sticking up there. I just have to align that with one of these castellations, whilst at the same time getting it very tight, which is my terminology. That's somewhere near where I want it. So now I'm going to have to move it on to the next castellation there. Almost. God, still not quite. Yeah, I would say that's it now. So I'll just tap that down, and then we're ready to start looking at the front end. You can see the marks here left by the diffuser vanes. So air comes into the, it's a compressor, so air comes into the guide vanes of the impeller. If you think of it in really basic terms, you would imagine quite rightly that these curved vanes tend to help pull air into it, which they do. In actual fact, if you take these off and the impeller just has the straight blades on it, it will also work, because the centrifuge of the air being forced out of these as it turns naturally will suck air in through the intake. These rotating guide vanes, and they use various different designs on the Merlin during its production, just make it more efficient. So the next thing is, again, if you think of it in basic terms, the air centrifuges out of these as it's spinning at very high speed. The tip of these, when this is at its maximum RPM at high altitude, in high gear, are about 850 miles an hour. So the air is getting forced out of here. Naturally enough, if you don't put anything inside this casing, it's just going to bombard the side walls of there, so it's going to hit straight into there, which is going to be inefficient. So these vanes actually direct the air around to where you want it to come out. But this is actually it, so this sits upside down on there. So these are the vanes. But actually they change area as well, so as the air comes out of here, what you're trying to do is slow it down, because you don't need 850 mile an hour air going into the engine. Slow it down and increase the pressure, and that's the compressor function of this thing. So you can kind of see it in very basic terms how it works, and then you can do all the really complex calculations, which Rolls-Royce did of course, and work out exactly what you want it to do, how much air you want it to put into the engine. And being an aircraft, you're also considering the altitude. So in reality, this impeller, which is 10.2 inches in diameter, is way bigger than anything you would ever need if the engine was only ever running at sea level. And in fact, when they put these Merlins into motor torpedo boats, they had to make variations to the carburettor so that the throttles were actually fully open. They made them smaller, and they chose the lowest gear ratio they could for these as well, so they slowed them down, but they did actually use it on sea level engines. So now we've locked up this nut, everything's turning okay on it. Fitted the diffuser, fitted 3 of these bolts in. There's a square cutout in the diffuser for the bolt to stop it turning, so you can just do the nut up from the outside. So to hold the casings together, you've got these 6 in the middle, and then you've got 56 1BA studs and bolts around the outside of the casing in true Rolls-Royce fashion. If you look at a Rolls-Royce rear axle on a 1920s or 30s car, you'll see what I'm on about. So now we're going to drop the top casing on. We just use a small amount of well seal. There's no gasket on this. That's it. Good. So as well as the 1BA studs, every so often, there's one there, there's a 1/4 inch stud which are close fitting in the case. I think there's maybe 4 of them on it. So they act as dowels, provide a location for everything, and then the rest of them you just pinch it all together. So now I've assembled the supercharger, we can move on to the intake elbow, which is this thing. This is what I was referring to earlier as the baby's bum or elephant's bum. Rolls-Royce called it the intake elbow. And one of the most critical parts about this is that it holds the tail bearings for this rotor. So the machining accuracy in terms of centering it on there has to be very close. and in fact they did have problems with these seizing up very early on until they got that precise, particularly because there is a bit of clearance on here. I can put this on and off the supercharger quite easily, which doesn't help. This is a feature of the second generation supercharger used on the Merlin. In early versions, particularly the Merlin 2 and 3 primarily, the tail bearing housing was part of the supercharger casing, which obviously made it easier to machine. But this piece here, which has got quite a bit of shape to it, was designed by Stanley Hooker, and it was the first project he took on when he started to work for Rolls-Royce. And if you're interested in the Merlin, I can recommend reading his autobiography. It's called Not Much of an Engineer, which alludes to the fact that he was a mathematician when he joined, but actually he went all the way through leading jet engine projects, and even after his retirement he went back into Rolls-Royce after they were bankrupted in the 1970s by the RB211 project. And thoroughly interesting guy, and a really brilliant book as well. So he put a lot of thought and maths into designing the airflows in here, and just by making it a little bit deeper, and you can sort of see the way the air flows out slightly and then back in, he was able to improve the efficiency of the engine by quite a lot. So now I just need to fit these concentric bushes onto the spindle here. I'm ready to put this intake elbow back on. Put some oil on them. And this feature that you can see around here, it's actually fed with water, comes in here out of the top, and it's in order to heat the air coming round into the supercharger to prevent the formation of ice on the inside of here, partly due to the high altitude, very cold air that the engine's operating in, and also the evaporation of the fuel, because the carburettor is underneath there. So the fuel air mixture also cools as it comes into the supercharger. Formation of ice on the inside of this elbow could break off and damage these blades, which actually rotate at speeds of up to 30,000 or approaching 30,000 RPM. But typically when it's cruising along, it's sort of 20 to 25,000 RPM. It can cause a lot of damage to that. Pop that on. Then this is called the induction elbow. This goes into the top of the supercharger, feeding air into the induction manifolds, obviously the engine, so we'll put that on. Then the blower will be ready to fit to the engine. So here's the completed supercharger, ready to go onto this engine. When it's been fitted, I'll put up a video of the test run and also strip the other one down, sort of see a little bit more about what's wrong with it and what needs to be done to repair it. It's hard to believe that this fell out of the sky in 1942 into the ground and didn't even suffer any damage. Now I've stripped the paint off it. It's just about as bright and shiny as the day it was first made. Absolutely incredible.